Today we'll be discussing the origins, meaning, and impact of slavery in society. Slavery was mentioned in Introduction to Sociology, Class 11, Chapter 2, Terms and Concepts and Their Usage in Sociology. But it just briefly touched upon why slavery is a highly discriminating form of social stratification. And through this video, I hope to make this more clearer and also shed some light on how slavery came into existence and why it came into existence and just a general history. So what is slavery? Slavery is one of the many forms of social stratification. And as we know from the chapter 2, social stratification is a systematic inequalities that exist in a society and influence an individual's access to resources and material/symbolic goods. So it's a systematic, socially sustained form of inequalities and discrimination. And it divides society into a hierarchy, similar to how in class 10 we saw a soil diagram where we have the topsoil, bedrock, parent rock, all those layers. Similarly, social stratification divides people into layers or a hierarchy, where the people in the top are superior and the people in the bottom stratas are inferior. Slavery is an extreme form of social stratification where people are not even treated as humans. They're exploited laborers, and it's socially and legally acceptable trade of humans. The reason why slavery is considered as one of the most discriminating extreme forms of inequality is because forget about basic human rights. Humans were not even treated as humans. They were sold. They were treated as commodities. That's why it's called the most extreme form of social stratification. If we look at this timeline here, around 200 BCE, slavery was born in Sumeria or Sumer, Greece. This city is known as the birthplace of slavery. In the CE Common Era, it was also rigorously practiced in the Indus Valley civilizations, Mesopotamian civilizations, and the Qin dynasty as well of China, Q-U-I-N, Qin dynasty of China. Now moving to the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries of Europe, slavery was a characteristic of feudal Europe as well. And lastly, it fueled the industrialization and plantation farming in USA. So, you might be wondering why Greece is the birthplace of slavery. In Greece, several philosophers and political thinkers were born from this land, whether it be Socrates or Plato or Aristotle. And Aristotle was a major supporter of slavery because he believed that slavery allowed the smooth functioning of society, since there's a separate class of people taking care of the laborious tasks, the mundane tasks, such as cleaning, feeding the children, harvesting, whatever it may be. All these tedious tasks were handled by a class of slaves, and it allowed political thinkers and philosophers and general educated individuals and intellectuals to prosper. So, in other words, this was an early form of functionalist theory, where society is considered to evolve through cooperation, and the society was considered as a human body where each organ or each class of society had a separate role to play. So this could be considered as an early form of functionalist theory, although it wasn't coined yet. So Sumer, Greece was the birthplace of slavery. Historians debate that slavery was practiced in the Indian subcontinent many centuries earlier, but Indian historians claim that in the Sanskrit language there's no word for slavery, and therefore slavery didn't exist, which seems somewhat irrational or unreasonable. But anyways, in feudal Europe there was a clear division of society based on the clergy, the monarchs, the intellectuals, and the businessmen, and the peasants and slaves. And lastly, through the triangular slave trade or transatlantic slave trade, several slaves were forced to the United States of America, North America, and they worked in plantation farms. So what is a slave, or more specifically, who is a slave? A slave is an individual who is legally owned or the legal property of someone else. So slaves can be bought and sold. They're not treated as a human, they're treated as a commodity, which can be used to carry out any tasks that the owner wishes. How did slavery come into existence? In the past, slavery was a result of debt, war, or a punishment for a crime. So for example, if you weren't able to repay your debt or the money that you borrowed, you would have to be a slave to the person that loaned you the money. Sometimes it could be the monarch, sometimes it could be the landowners. In India, it could have been the zamindars or the upper caste men. It could be different, but the basic idea is that if you owed money to someone, if you're in debt, you could repay them by being their slave. So you'd be forever loyal to them for generations and do whatever they wanted. You would be under them, under their feet for the rest of your life. It was also a result of war. So in the era of expansion, when kings invaded several lands, the people that were living in that land became the slaves of the king, the slaves of the invading country. And lastly, crime. If you ever committed a crime in some early forms of judiciary, you could be sentenced as a slave as a form of punishment. And also, the children of the slaves were also destined to be slaves for the rest of their lives. So it can also be considered as an ascribed status, where people don't have the decision. If you're born as a slave, you have to live as a slave for the rest of your life. However, in the early days, slaves led a better life than most of the peasants because they had shelter, their owners provided them with food and water, so all their basic necessities were covered. And this is why most peasants were envious of slaves. Other than the moral conflict and loss of dignity, in terms of material goods, slaves had everything they needed. Unless the owners were particularly torturous, which most of them were not. Slavery was only characterized or was attached to torture and exploitation when it entered the industrialization era and triangular slave trade. But before that, slaves were considered at a higher position than peasants, because peasants had to toil for little money, they didn't have much dignity in society anyways, and most of the time they have to live a life of bare sustenance. So they couldn't even find 2 square meals a day, shelter over their heads, clothes on their backs, or even water to drink. So in some ways, slaves led a better life than most of the peasants. How expansion impacted slavery. So as I mentioned earlier, the expansion and military rule of monarchs, tyrants, and totalitarians led to invasion, and the citizens of the invaded state would be subject to becoming a slave of the invading state. The captors would chain all the citizens of the invaded cities and deem them as slaves for the rest of their lives. So basically, the citizens of war-stricken nations or states of the time, they would become slaves to the captors. How did globalization, or more specifically industrialization, impact slavery? So, as an effect of the Industrial Revolution, mass labor was needed to carry out manufacturing. And the earliest form of slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean took place in the year 1619, when 20 men from Africa were brought to Virginia, USA. So, these 20 men, they worked in plantation farms, they were exploited, and the white owners realized that this business practice could sustain in the long term. It could bring them cheap labor, and it could fuel their industrial needs. So in 1660, the Royal African Slave Company was established. And keep in mind that this was an initiative of Africans themselves. It wasn't an initiative of the British or the United States. although the Britishers did have an influence, they consulted the African rulers, and through collaboration they established the company Royal African Slave Company. And this company legalized and officially facilitated transatlantic slave trade. But why African people in the first place? There are people all across the globe. Why did they only choose African people? The main reason was the physique. Africans were characterized as tall, muscular. They had the ability to carry large weights, and they had the appropriate physique to carry out laborious tasks. And the biggest reason of all, it's not because of the physique of the African people, more because there's a decline in indentured laborers. So in the UK, earlier they employed a few peasants as serfs. They're not bonded laborers. They were also called indentured laborers. So for the rest of their life, they are forced to toil for the owner. And it was a form of slavery, but the only difference is that they weren't exported or imported. It was just the people of the country, a few peasants, they became serfs or indentured laborers. And there was a decline from the 17th century because people began to realize how they are being mistreated. Human rights were being conceptualized, and there was these slowly emerging ideas such as liberty, equality, fraternity, and people became aware that they were openly being exploited, and so they started revolting. They didn't want to be in the status of an indentured laborer. So since there was a shortage in indentured laborers in Britain, the Britishers, or the capitalists, they took to Africa because the African rulers were also highly compliant with exporting or trading African people as slaves, because even within Africa there was a hierarchy of rulers and the common people. And the common people, they were uneducated, they were illiterate, they weren't aware of the consequences of entering those ships to go to America. And so the African rulers profited because they were being paid. They received a percentage of the total profits, and also the manufactured goods that were produced in Britain, they were exported to Africa at subsidized rates. So the African rulers, they were able to utilize these modern manufactured produced goods. They had a percentage of the total profits, and it didn't directly affect them or their families. They only exploited the bottom classes, the illiterate, uneducated classes that had nothing to offer except their own labor and their own muscular efforts. So this is why African people were chosen among all the different ethnicities. And the slaves were transported across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to America. And the transport of these slaves themselves was violative of many human rights. As you can see in this figure right here, the slaves were not given basic space. They covered every inch of the bottom deck of the ship. You can see in this plan that there was a stowage of 292 slaves, and 130 were being stowed under the shelves as shown in the figures. They had little to no space. They were divided as women, boys, and men. And as you can see here, they couldn't breathe. There was no natural lighting, no ventilation, no facilities, no food or water, and most of them died from many diseases such as sanitation diseases, the flu, dysentery, etc. And you can even see here there's a storeroom which contains even more slaves. So to me, this represents a goods ship, a goods container ship, where all the goods are stored in the bottom deck. It looks the same to me, which emphasizes the fact that slaves were considered as commodities and not humans. The transport itself was violative of several human rights, as you can see here. And now, let's look at the triangular slave trade. So there was 3 primary continents or countries involved in this triangular slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. So the enslaved Africans were shipped to the United States, or the 13 colonies, and they worked on the plantation farms. So the United States produced cash crops such as tobacco and cotton. So they were the producers of raw materials, and these raw materials were shipped to Europe, where the manufactured goods were produced. So, and these manufacturing goods were exported to Africa, where the rulers were able to utilize them. So as you can see here, labor is sent from Africa to North America. The raw materials are produced in North America and they're shipped to Europe. And the goods are manufactured from raw material to more valuable products, or the final goods, in Europe, and they're exported to Africa. So there's a triangular slave trade. This is an early form of globalization in the world, and this was in the 1700s and 1800s. However, new ideas and revolutionary leaders advocated an end to this malicious practice, and they promoted abolition of slavery. And this led to a protracted conflict between the North and the South of America. So if we come back to this American map, the US divided into the North and the South. The North was known as the Union, and the South was known as the Confederates, or the secession states. They wanted to secede from America because the North advocated for abolition of slavery, whereas the southern countries were against this practice of slavery. They supported the practice of slavery, and if slavery wasn't legal, they would secede from America. They would form their own country called the Confederate Nation. So this conflict took place in the 1860s, and the president during this time was Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of America. He was a strong leader. The war took place throughout his entire term, but towards the end, in 1863, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, which was just a 2-minute long speech, and he recalled the words of the founding fathers. He said, 77 years ago, our founding fathers established this nation, the United States of America, and they supported the ideals of liberty, freedom, and equality of the individual. And this speech was extremely compelling and groundbreaking, and it eventually led to the formation and signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which kept the United States as a whole, prevented secession, and legally abolished the practice of slavery. And similar practices took place in the UK. So now the question is, does slavery still exist in contemporary times? This is definitely, the answer to this question is yes. Human trafficking, child labor, and begar, which means, begar means forced contribution of labor without any payment. It still exists, especially in India, because in India we have a caste system which only exacerbates and increases the effects of slavery, because the members of the casteless societies are considered as slaves as well. And so, especially in some industries that require a lot of labor, such as agriculture, brick kilning, these industries always exploit people, and they also employ children under the age of 14, which should be going to school. And there's always human trafficking, especially in countries like Haiti and other nations where human rights are not enforced. So slavery still exists. Although our Constitution has special provisions in Article 23 and 24, which highlight the right against exploitation, it's a notion of society. Slavery, caste, all forms of social stratification, they're notions. They're not clear, they're not concrete aspects of society. They're abstract. So unless the mindset of the people changes, these systems will continue to exist. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great understanding of the history of slavery, origins, meaning, and significance. As always, I hope you enjoyed watching, had a great learning experience, and until the next one, this is Ch.2 signing off. Peace.